Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second College of Natural Sciences webinar. My name is Allison Sherwood. I'm the Interim Associate Dean for the College of Natural Sciences. CNS is one of the largest colleges on the Mānoa campus. We're home to over 115 faculty and approximately 2,500 students across 6 academic and research units. CNS plays a key role in STEM education for the state of Hawaii, and it's also one of the top units at UH Manoa for extramural research funding.
Join the meeting.
We have strengths in many STEM fields, including conservation, sustainability, marine sciences, astronomy, and the quantitative and computational sciences. Our goal is to share the very best of this research with you through this webinar series. We welcome our alumni to this event and look forward to getting to know you all better. A few reminders for today's presentation. First of all, we recommend selecting the speaker view during this presentation to be able to see our speakers. Please also turn off your microphones. You're welcome to ask questions in the chat box as our speakers are presenting today, but we're going to be reserving these questions for the end of the presentation. During our Q&A session at the end, we'll be asking questions from the chat, and you'll also have the opportunity at that point to ask questions directly. Our presentation today will be approximately 1 hour in length with a question and answer period afterwards. Now, today's presentation is interesting and unusual for us. It's a collaborative effort across colleges at UH Manoa and includes speakers from the College of Natural Sciences, as well as the Institute for Astronomy and the School of Ocean, Earth Sciences and Technology. And now I'd like to introduce our team of speakers today, beginning with Dr. Karen Meech. Karen Meech is an astronomer at the Institute for Astronomy and the current interim director for the Institute. Her expertise is in astrobiology, in particular in understanding how habitable worlds are formed, with a focus on the small leftovers of the early solar system processes of building planets. She's been leading the development of a space mission to study icy material in the asteroid belt and led the team to characterize the first interstellar object that was discovered passing through our solar system. Karen completed her graduate work at MIT, where she studied comets, and then came to the University of Hawaii as a faculty member. She was co-investigator for 3 different comet missions: Deep Impact, Epoxy, and Stardust Next. She received the NASA Group Achievement Awards for this mission work in 2011, and additional recognition for her work on the Stardust flight mission team in 2005. In 2013, she received the Director's Research Excellence Award. In 2015, she received the University of Hawaii Regents Medal for Research Excellence, and in 2018, the ARC Scientist of the Year Award. Larry Denneau is a software engineer at the Institute for Astronomy and the co-PI of the Asteroid Terrestrial Impact Last Alert System. Larry received his BS in Electrical Engineering from the University of Arizona and his PhD in Astronomy from Queen's University. He's been the chief architect of the Pan-STARRS Telescope Moving Object Processing System software that automatically identifies moving solar system objects. Grieg Steward is a professor in the Department of Oceanography, investigating the ecology and the diversity of plankton, bacteria, and viruses in the ocean, the atmosphere, and the deep subsurface. Grieg obtained his PhD in marine biology at the University of California, San Diego. He's participated in dozens of oceanographic research expeditions all over the world on small and large research vessels, and even on a nuclear submarine. He has participated in a number of summer graduate training courses at sea on the research vessel Kila Moana, based at the UH Marine Center, and has won awards for both his undergraduate and his graduate classroom teaching at UH. Rich Gazan is a professor in the Information and Computer Sciences Department of the College of Natural Sciences and chair of the Library and Information Science program. He is a member of the UH NASA Astrobiology Institute and a visiting researcher at the NASA Ames Research Center. He's interested in how people integrate diverse types of knowledge in interdisciplinary collaborations and online communities. And now I'd like to turn the webinar over to Dr. Karen Meech to start our presentation today. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction. All right, well, today we're hopefully going to have a very exciting, fast-paced journey through the history of life on Earth, how it might go into the future, and how it might end early. So life has existed on Earth longer than it will persist into the future. And part of this is due to the unusual for the solar system architecture where we have dry land and oceans. It's due to the presence of our large moon that stabilized the Earth's rotation, allowing our planet's climate, seasons, ocean circulation to stabilize. And nevertheless, our biological diversity and productivity on Earth peaked maybe 200 to 300 million years ago. So Earth as a habitat for animal life is in its very old age. And the age of plants and animals may be 95% done. So if we're going to survive, we must take steps to safeguard our planet. But if we can't engineer a way out of this problem, we better go planet shopping. And for that, we need to understand some astrobiology. So I want to start with this introduction by giving you a journey, visiting Earth as if we're on a spacecraft from another world, able to travel through time. And we're going to look at the normal process of life on Earth. And then the rest of the team will tell you how it might end early. So I want to start with a brief overview of our control panel on our spacecraft. We're going to keep track of where we are in time through two ways. We can either look at this green slider bar across the top. These are in 500 million year increments, where at this point we're at 4.5 billion years age. Or since the sun is going to live about 12 billion years, we can look at a clock as it progresses around in time. We're going to have a view of the Earth as it would be seen from space. We'll have a view of the surface of the planet, and any potential marine or surface life will get a glimpse of what it looks like if it exists. Since we're talking about habitability, we want to also look at some of the conditions on Earth, the temperature in centigrade. The average temperature today on Earth is about 15 degrees centigrade or about 59 degrees Fahrenheit. And reminder that the centigrade scale, 0 is the freezing point of water, 100 is the boiling point. We'll also keep track of the oxygen, which today is at 21%. And we'll keep track of the greenhouse gas carbon dioxide, which as of today is about 416 parts per million. Now this last part of the figure will show how the energy from the sun is increasing with time, and these are billions of years, relative to today's level at 1. Now, the reason the sun's energy is increasing with time, the sun is a big ball of gas and it must balance the pull of gravity from the pressure exerted from the inside thermonuclear reactions. And so as the hydrogen gets converted into helium, the helium is denser, it would tend to collapse. So in order that it doesn't, it burns hotter and puts out more energy. Now, the way in which we keep a balance and keep the world habitable is through three processes that control our planetary thermostat. One is plate tectonics, the movement of the plates over the mantle. This helps recycle some of the ingredients, in particular CO2. We have the carbon cycle, where we convert inorganic and organic carbon through the plants utilizing CO2 and then decaying. And then we finally have a weathering cycle, which combines output of volcanoes with rainwater that converts most of the CO2 on Earth into sedimentary rocks. So with that, let's take a journey. So Earth formed about 4.5 billion years ago, and it was very hot after it formed, and very early in the history, about 100 million years after it formed, there was a giant impact that created the young moon. So about 100 million years, we may have had a magma ocean, and the surface would have looked something like this. But it cooled off relatively rapidly, and within 200 to 300 million years after it formed, we probably had a world of liquid oceans. So we would have perhaps been a water world. And you can see the temperatures dropping at this point, a lot of CO2, no oxygen. Now we know that life started very early on Earth. There's fossil evidence of these primitive microbial mats called stromatolites, which are layers of cyanobacteria and sediments as early as 3.5 billion years. And the appearance of life marks the boundary between these two geologic time periods. Temperatures dropped, but it's still a very hot planet. In fact, we had evidence of life earlier than this in chemical signatures. The world would have looked very different, hot and humid, with kind of brownish skies. As we move a little further in time to about 1.5 billion years, the first protocontinents are starting to form through volcanic processes, much like what forms the Hawaiian Islands. Life on Earth is still microbial. And there's no surface life except the tides were so strong at this time, these stromatolites or mats of cyanobacteria may occasionally get exposed. Temperature continues to drop. And while these microorganisms are producing oxygen, it's so quickly gobbled up in chemical reactions, we're not yet registering any of it on our scales here. Now, there was a big catastrophe at about 2.2 billion years, and this was a global glaciation on Earth where the temperatures plummeted, and you can see they dropped way below zero on average. And this is because these cyanobacteria, the microorganisms, were becoming so successful, producing a lot of oxygen that we're now finally starting to register, but they were eating away at the greenhouse gas that kept the planet warm. Well, you might wonder, how do we get out of such a catastrophe? Well, the Earth has to get rid of its heat. And so it's constantly erupting volcanically, and that's putting more CO2 back in the atmosphere. And we're not removing the CO2 very well because there's no land exposed for weathering. So eventually we get the CO2 up high enough that we come out of this global ice age. And at this point, the first multicellular life appears. We're starting to get much larger continents growing. The larger the continents, the faster this weathering and removal of CO2, which has been dropping. We're almost a quarter of the way through the lifetime, and we're just barely at marine life. As time passes, we start to get ever bigger supercontinents. Another catastrophe occurred 600 to 800 million years ago with another global ice age where we had ice pole to pole. The average surface temperature may have been -50 centigrade, and the duration was maybe a few million years. However, these sort of global catastrophes can alter the course of life, and this may have stimulated a huge explosion of life that began a little bit gradually, maybe 600 million years ago, where we first start to get some evidence of fossils in the record with soft corals and jellyfish, things that don't fossilize well. And we're starting to finally get some surface life with some lichens. Temperatures are still much warmer than today, and we don't have an abundant oxygen. CO2 is still pretty high. But then about half a billion years ago, there was an explosion of life in the fossil record. Now, you may notice that we're starting to see some mass extinctions listed here, and this is largely, as we're going to see, due to volcanic eruptions. We're finally starting to see some surface life. It's not abundant, it's still microbial, but we're now seeing the evidence on the surface. About 400 million years ago, plants finally emerge onto the land. We see a drop in CO2 as we get a huge uptick in oxygen, and we start to see the geography of the land differ because now we can have rivers with tributaries and meanders as the roots start to hold sediments. As we get to about 300 million years ago, we get the Pangaea supercontinent, and we also get one of the largest mass extinctions ever, and this was probably a volcanic event. So although the life looks very abundant, this is probably the point at which it's the most abundant, and it's going to be a downhill slide from here. This mass extinction, by the way, got rid of 96% of all marine species and about 70% of all terrestrial life. Come further in time, we're starting to get bigger and bigger continent development, more mass extinctions, and then finally, the one that most people are familiar with, 65 million years ago, the land is starting to look more familiar. We had the giant meteor impact, asteroid impact at the Yucatan Peninsula. You can see the oxygen's almost up to current levels and the CO2 is almost down to current levels. We take a pause looking at our current world rich with technology. We think everything's great, but as we all know, there's a lot of problems. And in fact, we're burning fossil fuels at a huge rate. Everyone's talking about global warming. You know, people worry about this, but in fact, most people don't realize we are at the coolest point we have been in history for a long time because we're still in a global ice age. We just happen to be in an interglacial period of about 12,000 years, which has led to the rise of civilization. So while we are worrying about fossil fuels and global warming, make no mistake, we're eventually going to go back into a glacial period during this ice age. Whether it's a few thousand years or global warming pushes it off 50,000 years, it will happen, and the glaciers will again sweep down to mid-latitudes. We will have desert regions going far south, tundra, Arctic-like conditions. Now, this is certainly survivable even with these low global temperatures, but when this happened in the past, when these ice ages last 80 to 100,000 years, people moved south. With current populations of 7.7 billion people, and in 2100, maybe we're at 10 billion, maybe by 2150, 28 billion, there's no place to go. Eventually, this ice age will end maybe in 2 to 10 million years. And when we come out of it, there still will be humans, but the night lights may be more of campfires. And while there's still plenty of life, it's much less diverse. And in fact, we're going to see a drop precipitously in CO2. And what will happen at this point is, since plants need the CO2, we will get plants that can tolerate less and less, i.e. the grasses. About 250 million years into the future, we will again have a giant single continent. This is going to destroy a lot of the ocean circulation. We'll now, instead of have well-mixed oceans carrying heat distributed around the world, we're going to have anoxic oceans that are layered. Life will drastically decline, and we're going to get dropping CO2 levels, which will mean the loss of many of the plant species. By 500 million years, the big land animals are going to die. We're going to start to be losing our beautiful ocean world with the bluish atmosphere. You can see the marine life is looking quite sparse. At 800 million years, the CO2 levels are so critical, most of the plants are gone, and we're starting to lose our topsoil because the plants can't hold it. It gets washed into the sea, and now we're getting a very brownish world. You can see the temperatures are starting to climb, oxygen's decreasing, and the CO2 is decreasing. Eventually, the world is going to turn brown once the plants die, about 100 million years after the animals die. And as the temperatures start to rise, this is scary for me, maybe we'll be left with the only things on the surface will be microbes again, and maybe insects. Now, those of you who've noticed, we have these two hands that have frozen here. The interval between them shows the era of macroscopic life, plants and animals on land. The rest of the cycle is microbial life. As the temperatures increase even farther, they get up to 60, 70, 80 degrees centigrade. The only thing left will be microbial life that can suffer extreme temperatures, maybe some a little bit in water left on the surface, some in the oceans. Eventually, the sun is starting to get brighter. We're about 10% brighter. The temperatures are getting really high. We've lost the oxygen production capability, and now CO2 is starting to really increase in the atmosphere, and the oceans begin to evaporate. As they do so, we may end up with sort of a pinkish world as we're left with the evaporate salts on the surface of the Earth. And now the temperature's really going to climb. We'll have a very humid, hot, moist world. And as the water gets into the upper atmosphere, we'll have violent storms. Sunlight will break apart the water, hydrogen escapes, and now you'll see the oxygen really climb, but now we're going to get an oppressive atmospheric pressure, much like Venus. Eventually, all life ends, the oceans are completely gone. It's not all bad news, because about 3 billion years from now, should there be any aliens visiting, we'll see a beautiful view in the sky as our galaxy collides with the Andromeda galaxy. Stars individually won't collide, but it will be quite a light show in the sky. At about 11 billion years, our sun is running out of its nuclear fuel. It will start to become unstable. The outer atmosphere will swell outwards, reaching 2,000 degrees, melting the surface of the Earth, and eventually thermal pulses will lose most of the mass to space, vaporizing the innermost planets. Maybe Mars will be left as a burnt out cinder, and this will be what our solar system looks like for billions of years into the future. So that's the good news. Now we will hear about ways in which everything might end much, much sooner, and we'll start with Larry Denneau.
Thanks, Karen. Okay, I'm going to take control here. So while we're shopping for a new planet, I'll tell you about ways that life could end on Earth due to something from the sky or from space. Okay, I think we're still waiting for the.
You should be able to, Larry.
Okay, let's see here. There we go. Alrighty. Still waiting. Okay, there we are. So big rocks from space have captured our imagination for many, many decades since we knew they were out there. In 1958, one of the first dramatizations of the Earth being destroyed by something from outer space or a rock from outer space occurred in this movie called The Day the Sky Exploded. It was about a rogue rocket booster that disrupted a asteroid swarm, and that asteroid swarm turned into a lot of pieces that impacted the Earth. One unusual thing about this movie was it actually tried to show what impacting asteroids might look like if they were to hit the Earth. It's all the way back in 1958. Much later, in 1998, several weeks apart, Hollywood gave us two movies about the Earth being destroyed by asteroids. One, Deep Impact, the other Armageddon, famously with Bruce Willis in it. If you ask me, Deep Impact is a much better movie. But those both depicted asteroids on impact trajectories with Earth and the effort to try to stop that impact, which would have ended life on Earth. There's also another a little bit more obscure movie called Melancholia in 2011 that depicted the end of life on Earth due to a rogue planet that collided with Earth. Asteroids have also captured our imagination in video games, famously asteroids back in the 70s. So what are these rocks from space? What do we know about them? The first asteroid series, about 600 miles across, was discovered in 1801 by an Italian astronomer named Giuseppe Piazzi. He was looking for actually a planet that was hypothesized to be between the orbit of Mars and Jupiter. And what he found was this much smaller object called Ceres. The mathematician Gauss did some very delicate mathematics and determined its orbit, approximately between Mars and Jupiter, where they were looking. But the astronomers kept looking for other stuff out there. And by 1850, they discovered about 10 asteroids in similar orbits between Mars and Jupiter. And if you grew up when I did, you might have this image of the architecture of the solar system that prevailed for many, many decades with 8 major planets and an asteroid belt where most of these asteroids lived without disturbing other things in the solar system. But in the late 90s, with the advent of computerized surveys to look for solar system objects, our knowledge of the situation has changed dramatically. What we know now is that there are over 1 million asteroids of 100 meters and larger out in the main belt of the solar system. And this graphic here, when it loads, shows the approximate location, at one instant of those asteroids. The red dots in this diagram show asteroids that are hazardous to Earth, that come close to the Earth. And one thing you cannot see from this diagram is the path of those asteroids. And if we zoom in, showing the motion, what you'll see is that those asteroids have, instead of circular orbits that mostly exist between Mars and Jupiter, they have elliptical orbits that carry them out very close to Jupiter, well past Mars, but then bring them to the inner solar system where they can cross the orbits of Mars, Earth, Venus, and even Mercury. So these asteroids on elliptical orbits are the ones that pose a hazard to us. So where do they come from? What we know now is that asteroids and comets are primordial bodies from the solar system's infancy. They were created from the dust and gas present at the beginning of the solar system. Like the planets, they accreted through contact and then gradual gravitational accumulation of more stuff. But they didn't grow as fast as planets and therefore didn't become big enough to be a planet. So there were many of these bodies in the early solar system. As they were forming, some of them hit other ones and they broke up into smaller pieces. And what we have today is a population of these small bodies made of primordial material that are still out there floating around. Comets were formed similarly, but in the much farther outer solar system where they formed from icy material. And as we see them come into the inner solar system and get heated up, we see their spectacular tails as these ices and volatiles are released from the bodies and as they're heated up by the sun. So in that sense, these bodies are very interesting scientifically. They form a fossil record of the early solar system. And by studying asteroids and comets, we can learn a lot about how the early solar system formed. But the reason why we have a main belt of asteroids that's between Mars and Jupiter, the way to think about it is that much like a spacecraft can get a gravitational assist when it goes by a planet to send it farther out in the solar system, these bodies, when they come close to a planet like Jupiter or even Earth, can be gravitationally scattered somewhere else into the solar system. Jupiter, being the biggest of the bodies, does the most scattering, and it scatters a lot of these bodies into the inner solar system, creating this population of near-Earth asteroids. So every day, the Earth is hit by tiny asteroids. A 2-minute search on YouTube will show examples of things flying through the sky and burning up. There are famous meteorites that have hit cars, houses, even people. And a couple of years ago, a University of Hawaii telescope system imaged a fireball over the Big Island. That object, you can see the bright flash from it. That was in the middle of the night. This object was only about the size of a basketball, but for about 1 second, illuminated the night sky almost as bright as the daytime. So these things are happening all the time. But the possible danger to humans on the timescales that we care about wasn't really understood until 1994, when Comet ShoemakerLevy, which was only discovered 2 years before, was discovered to be orbiting Jupiter. So Jupiter and its gravity had captured this comet. This comet was orbiting Jupiter temporarily, and it was predicted to actually collide with Jupiter a couple of years after its discovery. So scientists very, very eagerly watched this happen. And on this, these diagrams here, you can see the impacts of the comet fragments as they hit Jupiter. These explosions are many times the size of Earth. And even though this object might have been only a few kilometers in diameter, it was capable of that kind of destruction on Jupiter. Much more recently, the Chelyabinsk meteor in 2013, this was a body about the size of a house that flew over that city, vaporized in the air. Some fragments made it to the ground and made this funny hole here in the snow. But that asteroid, even though it was only the size of a house, made this bright flash. 1,000 people were injured when they ran to their windows to see what it was, and the shock wave from this event blew the windows back into their faces, and so people were injured by falling glass. So even a small asteroid the size of a house is capable of injuring many people. Oh, just finishing the animation on ShoemakerLevy there. Okay. So to understand the actual hazard to humans today, we need to know what's out there. And near-Earth asteroid surveys over the last 20, 30 years have been trying to catalog all of the objects out there, from the largest all the way down, to assess the long-term hazard to humanity from these objects. And so this diagram here on the right shows the very largest near-Earth asteroids that we know about, and basically bigger than 1 kilometer in diameter, so almost a mile in diameter. We've got about 90% of them accounted for. Oops, sorry. And below that, even though they're still dangerous to us, we've only got about 30% of these 140-meter diameter ones and the Tunguska-sized ones. So Tunguska was the event in the early 1900s that flattened 1,000 miles of trees when this asteroid vaporized in the atmosphere before it hit the Earth. And we barely know of 1% of those objects. So we've got a lot more work to do, especially on the small end, in finding these dangerous objects. So what are the odds that something dangerous might hit us? The way to think about it is that at the smaller sizes, they're much more frequent. And the big question is, for the largest ones, how often can we expect one to hit? And the odds currently look like this: a 10-meter object. So this is, house size like the one in Russia. I'm sorry, 10 meters is much smaller than that. That's a 1 in 10-year event, maybe. At 100 meters, we're looking at 1 every 10,000 years. In 1,000 meters, which is sort of a large-scale global destruction, that might happen once every 500,000 years. Now, the big question is, where in those 500,000 years might one hit? Is it, a year from now, 1,000 years from now, 500,000 years from now? We don't know. But who's looking for these things? Asteroids are really interesting in that, or unusual in that, they're a natural event that can be predicted, but also mitigated once we know that they're about to happen. And so we have surveys that are looking for these objects, cataloging them, and also looking for them on their way toward impacting the Earth so that we can, if possible, mitigate the damage that they might cause. There are currently NASA-funded 4 surveys that are looking for these objects, and 2 of them are associated with the University of Hawaii. But they are the state of the art in trying to monitor the skies for dangerous objects. They've been successful on a small scale. We found over the last few years 4 impacting asteroids before they hit the Earth, but these are all tiny car-sized things and pose, no threat to humanity. The Chelyabinsk meteor that impacted over Russia was not detected by an astronomical survey because it came from the sun side. So the sun poses a problem for us in that nighttime astronomy cannot look in that direction. And so what we need to solve that problem is a spacecraft that's off the Earth looking for those objects. So if we find one of these objects, what are our options? At the small size, 10 meters, as you saw from Chelyabinsk, simply getting out of the way, putting yourself in a safe place is enough to protect life. At 100 meters, that's a lot more energy, a lot more destructive energy. The options are different. You can't really get out of the way of that easily. And it's also possible to deflect or try to destroy an asteroid like that if you know far enough in advance that it's coming so that you can put together a spacecraft mission to do something about it. At the 1,000-meter scale, we don't really know or have a good idea of what we could do. One of those is something that we hope to not find out about until we're technologically much more advanced and can either completely push a 1,000-meter asteroid off of its path that's going to impact the Earth or do something else about it. So flipping the probabilities over a time interval, how long will it take a 300-meter asteroid to hit us? A 300-meter asteroid is definitely global impact, continental sorts of devastation. And in 5,000 years, the odds of one of those hitting the Earth is pretty much 10%. But if you go up to about 500,000 years, which is a tiny, tiny instant in time in terms of Karen's 12 billion year calendar, we're almost 100% likely that one of those will hit the Earth. And I like to say that asteroids are nature's way of saying, how's your spacecraft or how's your space program coming along? Anyway, that's the danger from asteroids, and I'll pass it on. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you, Larry. So if you'll release control of the screen.
Oh, yep.
So next up, nominally would have been Mike Ottle, because we had done this talk before. He's the chair of the oceanography department, and he knew a lot about global and Earth volcanism. But as he's now retired, I'm taking on his role and presenting his slides. So, this is the next threat on our list, volcanism. Does Earth really hate us because they were the cause of many of the mass extinctions? No, it just doesn't care. These sorts of things are a way for the planet to release its heat. But if you take a look, most of the life that has ever existed is now extinct. And in all of the big 5 extinctions that we've identified in somewhat recent history, 4 of these big ones are very likely to have been due to volcanic eruptions. This one is the one that's associated with the large impact, the extinction of the dinosaurs. So while many of us have seen volcanic landforms, and many of these are just beautiful spots for photography, as we all know, as many of us have experienced some news of volcanic eruptions, they can be extremely dangerous. But the sort of eruptions that we think of are nothing compared to massive supervolcanoes of the past. So what is a supervolcano? Normally, when you're talking about a volcanic eruption, you're talking about the amount of rock that's effectively erupted from the surface, the magma that forms into solid rock in terms of cubic kilometers of volume. So for something to be a supervolcano, we're looking at greater than about 1,000 cubic kilometers of rock. So some of the little ones we're just putting on this scale are tiny. These up here represent the scale of a supervolcano. The one that is the largest in somewhat recent history was Lake Toba in Sumatra that erupted 74,000 years ago, and it was almost 3,000 cubic kilometers of rock. The leftover crater is about 100 by 30 kilometers, and it's a kilometer or half a mile deep. And they think this is the largest eruption in the last 25 million years, and it may have caused a genetic bottleneck. The top 5 supervolcanoes on Earth right now, if you take a look, Lake Toba is number 2, But number 4 here is our friend Yellowstone in the United States. So Yellowstone is an absolutely beautiful national park, a beautiful volcano, but it is deadly. It erupts roughly every 730,000 years. The chances are small that it will be in the next few thousand years. In fact, they're looking at the top number 5 is looking for changes that might happen more recently. To give you an idea of the volume of the magma chamber under Yellowstone goes down about 500 kilometers. So it's a huge magma chamber. This is what we call a hotspot volcano. It's coming up from deep in the mantle, and then the plates are moving across it, much like the Hawaiian Islands. And so you tend to see a linear track of volcanic activity. And this is the hotspot that is responsible for Yellowstone. When it last erupted, this is the predicted ashfall. And the danger of these type of volcanoes is that the gas and dust that gets released into the atmosphere can stay for decades. You can increase the global temperature by 10 degrees, which is catastrophic for many ecosystems just by virtue of the greenhouse gases you put in, or you can cause a global cooling because of the ash. Now, while these sound scary, these are nothing like the big things that cause the major extinctions. It gets worse. And these are the absolutely massive, gigantic eruptions called large igneous provinces. And these just dwarf the others in scale. They tend to be in the millions of cubic kilometers. The volcanic eruption itself can last millions of years. And one of the biggest was 250 million years ago, erupted in Siberia. And this caused about 95% extinction of life on Earth. And they don't know exactly why these form, but they may be forming from the development of a new hotspot volcano as you get a plume of material rising up from the core mantle boundary as it reaches the surface. If you take a look at the map of the Earth, all of these colored regions are past eruptions of these large igneous provinces, many of which are under the ocean, some of which are on land. This was the big Siberian eruption. And this is a common style of volcanism in the solar system. It will happen again. Unlike asteroids, there's nothing we can do about it, and we don't know when. So the danger is they are correlated with most of Earth's mass extinctions, and I'm sure you can imagine the devastating effects. This just shows you what a sea level rise of 10 meters, 60 meters might cause on the eastern seaboard of the United States. Long-term global change, climate change, and mass extinctions. Well, with that, we will move on to the next threat, the self-destruction of Earth, threats from biology. So Grieg.
Okay, I'm requesting control.
I'm just about to hit the
Houston.
There we go. Sorry about that. All right.
Okay. So what does biology have in store for us? Possible fate of the human species. As Larry showed in his talk about asteroids, the movies often reflect our dreams and our fears. And our imaginations dream up lots of stories about nature run amok with humans facing threats from fellow animals and imagined aliens. Let me see if I can advance. I don't seem to have control yet. It says I'm controlling, but nothing's happening yet.
Your space bar?
No go.
There you go.
There we go. And so a lot of these stories of reflecting that terrifying human experience of going from being the hunter to the hunted, often though are farcical, if not far-fetched, if not outright farcical. Far more realistic threats to humans come from not large predators, but from microscopic pathogens. Things that are all the more frightening because we can't see them and don't know where they come from. They're so tiny, you can't see them coming. And these have also been popular fodder for tales about the demise of our species. And they do have an air of greater plausibility because of the long recorded history of devastating epidemic and pandemic diseases. And microbial and viral diseases have indeed contributed to the demise of civilizations, although not to this point to the entire human race. Now, for many of us, when we hear about bacteria and viruses, it's most often in the context of disease. And undoubtedly, viral diseases is on everyone's mind right now, as we are 1.5 years into the COVID-19 pandemic. So we are living it at the moment, a pandemic that's already claimed close to 4 million lives. But before we talk about pandemics, I want to just take a brief detour, because as I evolved into a microbial ecologist, I came to have a love for both bacteria and viruses and microbes in general. And so I want to just reiterate how important microbes and even viruses are to us before we look at the devastation they can do. So a couple notes. As we saw, microbial life is the foundation. It was the origin of life on this planet. It is from which macroscopic life or multicellular life arose, and multicellular life is dependent upon that microbial foundation. And their activities are crucial for our survival. And by way of example, most of my work is done in the ocean. So an ocean example here is how we depend on the microbes in so many ways. And this is just one simple example. Most of the photosynthesis that happens in the vast majority of the photosynthesis happening in the ocean is done by microscopic organisms, bacteria and protists. They do the photosynthesis that produces half of the oxygen that gets produced every day on this planet, the other half from land plants. So they create the oxygen that we absolutely depend on to breathe. They also feed the entire marine food web that produces food that we eat. So food, oxygen to breathe. And then the microbial decomposers, absolutely essential for breaking down organic and recycling, doing that absolutely critical recycling of nutrients that allows the whole system to continue cycling and continue to produce more food. So absolutely essential to us in terms of ecosystem services. And these are just a couple of examples of how we depend on them. And it's more personal than that, because we not only depend on them for ecosystem services, most of what we are is microbial. Even though we are large multicellular organisms, we have within us and on us lots and lots of microbes that are critical for the healthy functioning of our bodies. So over half of the cells that make up a human body are not human cells. They are bacteria, archaea, and fungi, and in our guts, tons of bacteria. And even our human genome. We see the remnants of ancient viral infections, endogenous retroviral sequences in the human genome. Our genome is 5 to 8% of remnants of viruses. So we really are built from and what we are and how we live, our behavior and our shape. A lot of that dictated through a long history of evolution with the microbes. Okay, but it's not all roses. So yes, absolutely essential, and they make up a large part of what we are and what we've become. But there is that thorn that sometimes they try to kill us. So these mutualistic interactions are a foundational state of life, but there's constant competition as well, and interactions and evolution. It's always about change. They're constantly challenging the stability of the system. And bacterial and viral diseases have always been a scourge, sometimes spreading very rapidly over broad areas in what we know as pandemics. So here's a nice graphic from the visual capitalists you can find online. I like this because it gives you a nice sense of scale and time about the influences of pandemics. And we see here these vaguely threatening puffballs here. The volume of each puffball there is representing the death toll for a given pandemic. And back toward the back there in the blue is the Black Death, which is the biggest of them all. in terms of absolute death toll. It looks a little bit smaller because it's further in the back. But then in more recent times, we see examples like of various influenza outbreaks and HIV/AIDS here in the foreground in the red. And you'll see in the very, very foreground, the pandemic through which we are living right now. And in that context, doesn't look too bad. This is a little bit out of date. We are closer to 4 million now. And it's ongoing. So we don't actually know where it will stop, but if we project possibly the number of deaths doubling, maybe even tripling, this would probably get up to the size of the third plague one here, just to the left of the green. So here they are. Yeah, so approximately that size if we project into the future. So here they are lined up side by side by death toll. And again, it's uncertain about COVID-19 shown down here. That's why it's in hatch marks, because it's still ongoing and could be as large as the third plague before it's all said and done. Just to give you a sense of scale of the severity of the bubonic plague back in the 1300s. Now, I wanted to show it in a slightly different way. So I took the same data and expressed it as not just total death toll, but as a percentage of the global population. So that's what we're going to see next here. So here are deaths as a percentage of global population along this axis as a function of time. I have also encoded it by whether it's a bacterial caused pandemic or viral or unknown. And there are a couple of unknowns there. And you'll see the bubonic plague here. It's a bacterial. It's the largest in absolute death toll. Also shown here is the size of the circle gives you the absolute death toll. The position on this axis gives you the percent of global population that died as a result. And a couple of observations you can see here. One, all of these most recent largish pandemics have been all viral. And that's no doubt partly due to the fact that bacteria are living entities, and we have ways that are easier to treat bacteria through antibiotics and so forth. Viruses, not alive as a virion, they actually replicate inside our cells. It makes it much harder to target and stop them. So viruses are a little harder to fight. So these most recent pandemics, we see they are viral. We also see maybe a declining impact. You'll see this really large for bubonic plague, but Spanish flu, HIV/AIDS ongoing, but declining, COVID-19 ongoing, but probably is not going to get too much larger, maybe doubling. So the absolute death toll is shrinking. But the other thing is in the inset now I'm showing human population. So the death toll itself is going down and the population is going up. So overall, we're going way down on this death axis. But of course, as paraphrasing Yogi Berra, I don't like to make predictions, especially about the future. Many uncertainties about this. And we don't know when COVID-19 is over until it's over. Things can always change and another big one could come along. So I wanted to just do a couple of observations about viral dynamics relevant to this point and about the likelihood of being wiped out by a viral pandemic. It turns out killing off population with viruses is pretty difficult. Hosts evolve resistance fairly easily, and viruses will tend to evolve over time towards decreased virulence in many cases, not always. So I'm just going to give you an example from our own work. So my colleague, Kyle Edwards, and a postdoc, Leticia D'Aglio, some isolates that we collected, harvested, and are growing in the lab, and viruses that infect them. This is showing the amount of phytoplankton on the y-axis and time in days. And so we have 4 cultures growing here. Viruses were added here where the arrow is to 2 of the cultures in red. And you see in response to that, those populations absolutely crash. 99% loss of those populations. But whoa, just wait a little while, boom, they come right back. And when you assay those things, what we find out is these are genetic subtypes that have evolved resistance. And this happens pretty frequently. And it's not just in microbial life. They found this out the hard way in Australia, trying to control invasive rabbits. The attempts to control it with a viral infection, this myxomatosis virus. Released into the wild, you see a devastating collapse in the virus, in the rabbit population, and then it creeps back. Rabbit fleas were used to help spread the transmission of the virus from rabbit to rabbit, another devastating crash, and it creeps back up. Another virus, this hemorrhagic disease virus, calicivirus, also introduced, crashed, but you see also coming back. It's pretty dang hard to wipe out an entire population if it's large enough with a viral infection. And this is just showing that the change in the severity of the illness from that virus over time becomes ameliorated. Very fatal. The first round wave of epidemic of this virus through the population, it's fatal or near fatal. But as wave after wave of epidemic comes through, you'll see they have adapted to it. It becomes much less lethal. And this happens frequently. So will we be done in by a viral pandemic? Seems improbable. We've survived a long history of onslaught already, and the population, and you see, if you look at the human population I showed earlier, it just keeps climbing up, chugging merrily along. So a viral pandemic on its own probably won't do it. However, other stressors from our increasing population could act synergistically. So, things go well when everything is in balance, but there are signs of imbalance, unsustainable growth in the face of finite resources. This leads to problems. Overshoot of our carrying capacity, leading to crowding, buildup of waste, decline in food, stress, and that ultimately exacerbates and makes us more vulnerable to diseases. And we see these signs of imbalance in overcrowding, the accumulation of wastes in our coastal water, frequently finding plastics now more and more frequently inside of marine life. So the question is, are we doomed, as prophesied by Paul Ehrlich in his book, 1968, The Population Bomb? Are we doomed like the caribou on St. Matthew's Island, where they were victims of their own success, grew too much, wiped out their food source, severe winters, disease, combination of factors ultimately driving their numbers into oblivion. So are we doomed? Well, a more recent book, The Coming Population Crash, poses a different scenario. And so the question is, will we manage to slow our growth at a more manageable rate? And there is hope. We do see signs that we are no longer in exponential growth with the human population. We've gone into a linear phase. It is slowly starting to crest and slow down, and it is anticipated that it is going to peak and possibly even reverse, with all of its other implications from a declining population, some of them quite severe. Nevertheless, our prospects in the long term, as Karen eloquently showed us, the Earth is doomed. So in the short term, we might be okay if we can stop polluting our nest. And maybe we can use our big brains to fly away before the Earth gets incinerated. But to do that, it's very clear at this point, we have a long way to go to figure out how to be self-sustaining. If we can't do it on this planet from which we sprung and which seems custom designed for us to survive at this point, if we could screw that up, then we don't have much hope. But maybe our big brains will get us out of this. Technology to the rescue, perhaps. We'll hear whether that might be the case. And I will stop sharing.
Okay, so if you can give the control back to me.
View options, stop remote control.
All right, so our next speaker will be our last one. This is Rich Gazan, and he will tell us about our last big threat, the threat from technology. So Rich, you should have control now.
Okay, thanks everybody. So we've heard about some pretty unpleasant situations. I think everybody would agree, but there is some good news. I'm going to tell you about the most powerful force in the universe, and that is the human ability to distract ourselves from unpleasant situations. We are extremely good at this, and one of the benefits we have over everything else you've heard about, on this talk is that the time scales are very, very much in our favor comparatively. So here's just a quick graphic of how immersed we are just in the internet. Each of these is a different country. You can see, worldwide, the average January 21 is something in the neighborhood of 7 hours a day for internet users age 16 to 64. The US is immediately to the left of that. So, but you can see the range of how normalized this has become, how we're engaging and interacting with screens and virtual environments through one mode or another. So there's 7 hours gone. And here's another look a couple years back and 1 year ahead at all media. So you see that US roughly 7 hours number in in the top, just in all the digital media. Notice that mobile is growing a lot, and desktop, laptop is a little bit steady state, and this lower down, it includes TV, radio, and especially if you are a library and information science person like I am, avert your eyes from the minutes that we spend on print resources these days. But if you look at the bottom, now suddenly the amount of media that we're immersed in, yes, we can do dual screens and multiple things at the same time, is starting to look like by far the majority of our time, that we're already not just voluntarily doing this. I mean, yes, there are work responsibilities, but in most cases, we are paying for the privilege to have access to information that is existing other than where and when we are through all of these devices. And yeah, most of this is fairly passive. There's very much an imbalance of what we consume versus what we produce and upload. I think it's pretty safe to say I'm looking at 106 participants on this Zoom. If all of you move your eyes something like 6 inches downward, you will probably see an interface from 150 years ago, the QWERTY keyboard, which we are still using, which is appallingly slow and archaic, whether we're using a thumb equivalent or not. So the devices and the infrastructure that we've developed have had this inherent asymmetry where we are consuming information, not so much sharing it. But that doesn't need to always be the case. Now, I find this image horrifying and beautiful at the same time. And it's sort of a yesterday's tomorrow image, which I'll explain in a bit. This is the sort of thing that you release for shock value mostly. And if you talk to most people, they'd say, oh, who would ever wear something like that? Now, some part of the population, you will be able to get them to wear something like this if you say you will be able to surf a 50-foot wave on an alien planet listening to whatever music you want. You can dial in if you want to be smelling toasting brown sugar cinnamon Pop-Tarts as you do this. Any kind of virtual immersive environment that you can dial in. But there's going to be a cost to this. And part of that cost is that you won't just be consuming information, your brain will be helping to process it and create it for other people. Now, where are we with this? Every so often I'll give a talk like this, and I'll always need to update the image on the left. Currently, the alpha supercomputer in the world is Fugaku. It has roughly the processing power of 200 people now, and that is a leap forward from a few years ago. But focus on the differences in the energy requirements and the cost, the maintenance, the people you need to hire to keep the supercomputer running. Human brains are extremely energy efficient, it takes a lot less to keep us going and engage us and activates our brain's inherent wish to process beyond what it is currently experiencing. So what can we do about this? That, the thing with all the wires was yesterday's tomorrow. This is one company's image of a near future tomorrow. And Neuralink, one of Elon Musk's many startups, they have an implantable device that you can use as a very simple way to control devices, computers, mobile devices, without having to use the keyboard. They're calling it brain hacking. You can go to the Neuralink site if you want, but this exists in prototype form. This is certainly not the only company who's using this, but here again, you may get people to sign up for this just to have the newest, coolest thing, to be able to control something at a distance. But once you start broadening the links between the electronics and the neurons, would you get something like this implanted if you were experiencing chronic pain? And it would promise you that now you would no longer need to. Then you'd probably reconsider it, right? Before I leave this slide, anytime there's a startup, I always like to look at their job postings, like who are they trying to hire? Now, Neuralink, you can see a summary on the slide about engineering science, computer science. They're also hiring a robust legal team. I could find no single instance of the word ethics, ethicist. I tried a lot of variants. That they're not there yet. But this is one model of what this future two-way interface could look like. This is designed one person to a device or a series of devices, but between people and then coordinated by a centralized system is not very far away and arguably a lot more efficient, though you could certainly have the option. So we've already made some of these choices, right? If you look at real life, how much of a struggle it is. There are obstacles that not everybody can surmount. There are limited goods everywhere we see. But if it becomes an economic value to have low energy processing power, then suddenly that creates much more of, it completely upends what labor is. We're going to need new laws for this, new economic systems, all kinds of rules and agreements about what happens in virtual life, in simulated environments. And you can be, I want to return to the ethics thing too. Laws, morals, physics. Is it morally wrong to blow away with a big gun a bunch of pixels? I don't think anybody would say it is, but new forms of interactive rules and ways of living and ways of being that would arguably change the definition of what it means to be human are awaiting us in virtual life. It would not need to be mandatory, it would not need to be full-time, and it may be extremely effective on a lot of levels for a lot of people. So this is my proposal, that I think we will willingly become part of the matrix. It will be extremely biotechnological. We will generate, experience our own stories. And like Grieg was saying, there is no reason at all that we couldn't be doing this while on the way to another planet. Why would we do this to ourselves? Well, real life is kind of hard. Okay, that's it for me. Thanks.
All right, Rich, okay, great. So just two last slides to finish off here. So have you given me control, Rich?
Yes, I released control.
Okay, so we know that the Earth is dying. We've got a lot of problems on the natural scale, but it may end much, much sooner for these various reasons that we've discussed today. And I'm hoping very much on this last slide, I'm saying it's the end of the talk, but I'm hoping it's not the end of everything. So with this, we will open it up for questions, but I believe Allison has a brief survey for everyone.
Yeah, I'd like to thank Karen, Larry, Grieg, and Rich for sharing your thought-provoking perspectives with us today on end-of-life scenarios. And yes, we would like to open our Q&A session with a poll. So I'm going to launch that right now. Okay, so on your screen now, you should see a series of questions related to the different topics that our speakers covered today. So which end-of-life on Earth scenario worries you the most? Is it number 1, Earth's natural evolution by Karen, asteroid impact that Larry described, large volcanic eruptions that Karen talked about, viruses, bacteria, biology by Grieg, or technology that Rich described? And we will take...
Do we have to only pick one?
You can only get one.
Maybe they all worry you, but just go for your top one today.
Think about once we can do something about.
I'll leave the poll open another 10 seconds or so. Okay, so most of you have voted by this point. I'm going to go ahead and the poll and share the results. And so speakers, I will leave it to you to discuss our results.
Now this is very interesting. When we had done a talk like this in 2012, it was about 80% vote for large volcanic eruptions. It will happen and there is nothing we can do about it. And I think people felt asteroid impact, maybe we can mitigate it. Biology, if we get smarter, maybe we can do something. Technology, that's in our control. But it's very interesting to see that Rich has convinced you this is going to be the biggest problem of all. So questions?
I have a question for Miss Dr. Meech. I'm wondering if there are any planets nearby that in their natural course of evolution will eventually be Earth-like, maybe overlapping the same process of our own that we could kind of just hop over to instead of, you know, dying a fiery death.
Yeah, I think ultimately that's going to be the solution. In our solar system, no, but we now have over 4,000 known extrasolar planets and about 10,000 candidates. And many of these are multi-planet systems, and many of them have planets in the so-called Goldilocks zone where the climate could be just right. We don't yet have the technology to study them. Even the very nearest star system is close enough, and it does have planets, and it does have planets in its habitable zone. The trick now will be to develop the technology to get people there safely and in large numbers. And of course, there's the ethical point of view. Do you have to prove that there's no intelligent life there before we invade a new world? So I think that will be the solution. And given the timescales, as long as an asteroid doesn't wipe us out in the next 100 years, I think technologically we will have those skills.
Thank you.
Hello,
Yes.
this is Danny Quintana. I work with the Global High Seas Marine Preserve. I have a lot of students that are really enthusiastic, and if I'm optimistic about the future, I think we can turn things around. I think if we can amend the law of the seas treaty and create a global high seas marine preserve, we can protect all of the wildlife. What are your thoughts on that? Any of you?
Well, Yeah, I guess since I'm in the oceanography department, I can field that one. And I share your optimism. And I think it's difficult because we do have a tendency to only make changes in the face of crisis. Planning ahead, we as a species have not been particularly good at, but I think especially with younger generations coming and the teaching that I do, I see that they are committed to making the changes that need to be made. It is a challenge because of all the infrastructure and the financial institutions and everything that's built up to perpetuate the way things are now. But I share your optimism, education, and just digging in with the will. We can make positive changes. I hope we're right.
Oh, by the way, I look forward to working with you guys. We put together an internship program with the University of Hawaii with oceanography, natural resources, business, culinary, and law. And I coordinated that with Professor Mark Hickson. So I'm really looking forward to going back to Hawaii. Right now, I'm in a really nice place up here in the mountains. But my heart's in Hawaii.
Of course, even with
Thanks,
all
sir.
that, if we get the next period of ice in this ice age is in a few thousand years, how do we feed the population? That's going to be a struggle. So other questions for any of the team?
I have a question. This is Cheryl Ernst. You didn't put the human factor in about whether we might just kill each other, kill ourselves off. So what about that dynamic?
Well, that's certainly a problem. I was more worried about the natural causes. You know, I'm not qualified to speak on that. It's not looking good. Humans don't seem to get along very well with each other.
Karen, I can say a little bit about that. One interesting thing about the Chelyabinsk meteor over Russia is that if it happened 25 or 30 years ago, they might have thought it was an attack from the United States, and nobody thought that. And so I would say we're improving in that regard.
Yeah, I would say, you know, with all the wonderful advances in telecommunications, do we communicate better? Or are we just, is it easier for us to misunderstand each other and run into, and maybe even create more conflict than we otherwise would have had? So yeah, technology has a, you know, definitely has a role in that too.
Are there other questions for our speakers?
I have a question, and it has, and I'm Bryant, and I'm not Susan. Susan is my wife, and she just retired from UH, and I haven't done the tech thing and changed the name. But in the sort of interstellar travel and looking for other habitable places, it seems that that the extraordinary amount of biology that you would need and biodiversity that you would need in order to inhabit another world would be a rather daunting challenge. Would you need to do bioengineering on the things that you brought over for them to fill those niches? Because it really, I mean, life has been here for a long time in order to fill all the niches and to make things as nice as it is for us now. And I'll let anyone field that.
Like, I like to look at the experiments like the Biosphere 2 that was shown in Grieg's presentation. You know, people have donated large sums of money to try that experiment. You know, that was intended to be a 2-year project. You know, thousands of species were put in there to see if they could be completely self-sustaining. And they had problems. They had to let in air. And people said it was a failure, but I think it was a marvelous success because we understand how little we know about creating a self-sustaining environment and how big it has to be. And even for transport to another world, you need to understand this. So either you take a planet devoid of life and do bioengineering and bring everything you need, and at least at first you're living in an enclosed habitat, or you find a world that's got life that's compatible enough that we could live there, but that's also daunting. So I think probably we go the way of bringing everything we need, but we're a long ways from that.
Yeah, I agree. It's one of those failures that was absolutely critical because we learned a lot, and we need more like that if that's the route we want to take.
And that was just a private donor that believed very strongly this was the experiment that needed to be done. Now it's owned, I believe, by the University, Arizona State University, and they're doing experiments in there on all sorts of things. You can tour through it. It's a very nice facility. So it looks like there's a question in the chat from Rick Martin. Aren't all planets made from the same stuff by the same processes? Do they evolve the same as Earth has? Are they then all similarly doomed to extinction? Probably yes. From the point of view of the planetary system, we know how stars work, we know how they evolve, and so eventually the power source that gives a planet life will go out, and so the planet will be destroyed. So yes, in that sense. From the biological point of view, we like to think of Earth as having had life for a long time, and when you're thinking of looking for life elsewhere, Frank Drake did this Drake equation to estimate the probability of life in the universe. And he looked at the lifetimes of planets and the lifetimes of life on planets. But what we're seeing is that there's a much greatly reduced lifetime when you can even have large life on a planet. And given Cheryl's question, who knows how long we'll be technologically present and not destroying ourselves in a sense. So it may be very different elsewhere in terms of the life portion, but from the planetary physics, everything, we pretty much understand how it's going to go. Other questions?
I have a question for Grieg, actually. If you had to predict what the next big microbe would be that would take down the current day human population, what sort of thing do you think it would be that would cause the most widespread death?
Boy, great question. I think there's this trade-off between virulence, things that tend to be particularly lethal, and their ability to spread. And those things that are most lethal, like Ebola, tend not to get very far. But it's, it'd be something like that with a very high case fatality rate, like an Ebola, which would, say, spread easily through aerosol transmission. What exactly that would be, or what type of virus, I couldn't really say. Or one that's got sort of a time delay to it, so you don't know when people are sick. I always said that the perfect viral pathogen would be one that didn't cause any symptoms, so you didn't know to avoid people. But then I thought, well, actually, no, a perfect one probably is a viral infection that makes you more gregarious or amorous and actually makes you seek out other people. And that's not too far fetched. So if you had something like that with a time delay effect for when it kicked in and actually killed you, that could be pretty devastating.
Following up on that, Greg, what about the resistant bacteria that's developing? Do you see that as a threat, or is that sort of minor in terms of the overall virulence of viruses versus bacteria?
No, certainly that is a threat, and certainly one of the reasons we probably have seen more viral infections than bacterial, at least causing serious widespread disease, is the ability to use things like antibiotics. But of course, we do have the increasing rates of antibiotic resistance and the spread from one bacterium to another, one species to another of antibiotic resistance, which is absolutely a concern. Yeah.
Got a question in the chat here from Carolyn. In our search for life beyond Earth, have we seen worlds in different stages of development? Can we see planets that are in the end stage of evolution, as you described, millions of years from now? Well, I do know of some extrasolar planetary systems where they had planets very close to the host star that are effectively being destroyed. And that's effectively like what I described when our sun is getting into the red giant stage, because they look like they have comet tails. And that's just because the heat of the star is vaporizing their atmosphere, it's blowing it off, and those planets are effectively being destroyed. You know, this is a really rich field of science. It's getting more and more exciting as they discover more of these planets and are building up new powerful telescopes and instruments to, now that we see the planet, to start to characterize them. But we're not at a stage where we can really characterize them well yet, but that's where the next frontier is in this field. Here's a question to everyone. Could terraforming extend the habitability of the Earth? Would other planets in the solar system be habitable in the red giant phase of the sun? I'm not sure terraforming the Earth is the thing that you want to do, because once we're getting to the point where the Earth is becoming uninhabitable, it's partly getting too close to the sun. It's no longer in the habitable zone because the sun's temperature is increasing. So if you're going to go that route, I would go farther out in the solar system. Maybe we should start with Mars now. It once was habitable. It's cold now, but you could terraform Mars and make it habitable. But in the red giant phase, I'd want to be much farther from the sun. And then you're looking at the gas giants, which would not be habitable. They do have big moons, so those are possibilities. But anything very close to the gas giants, you have huge radiation environments. So if I'm going to go through that trouble and the technology, I'm opting for another solar system or a free-floating spaceship arc that you can just live in space. Another question from John Smith: will this program be stored online with public access?
I can speak to that. Yes, indeed, we are recording all of our CNS webinars, and we're going to be posting them to our CNS YouTube channel. And the link to that channel will be distributed with your next invitation to our next webinar. So you will have access to that very soon.
So another question from Carolyn: if they were in the habitable zone, could they have had life? And I think this is referring to the planets that may now be destroyed. Absolutely. We do know of quite a number of planets in the habitable zone, but we don't yet have the ability to tell if they have life. We're not quite there technologically.
Sorry, that was a follow-up question to my first one.
That's what I thought.
Okay.
I have another question. It's sort of an overlapping question about the possibility of a phenomena called panspermia. We were talking about comets earlier, and is there a possibility that life has traveled through space, you know, trapped inside comets or alongside asteroids and other things of that nature to other planets, potentially our planet in its history?
Yeah, actually, you know, Mars was once very habitable. It probably had liquid water on the surface, oceans at the time life was forming on Earth. And because it's so much smaller, it's much easier from a meteorite impact to eject a chunk of Mars and have it land on Earth than it is to go from Earth elsewhere because of our higher gravity. And I know people have done simulations that you could even eject material from Mars or Earth to the outer solar system and hit some of the icy moons around the giant planets that are potentially exciting places for life. For example, Jupiter's moon Europa has a subsurface ocean. It's got organic compounds. We think it may have hydrothermal vents on the ocean floor. So who knows, maybe there's an ocean teeming with life. So some people, in fact, suggest that, who knows, we could be Martians. Maybe life started on Mars and got planted here. So yes, that's all possible.
I have a question for all of you. My last book is Copernicus Was Mistaken, Why the Earth is Still the Center of the Universe. The reason I argue the Earth is still the center of the universe is because in our star system, this is the only place that we know of that has any complex life. And obviously all of the other star systems are just so far from Earth, even Proxima Centauri, that if you can't get there, it's really not relevant. So what are your thoughts on, for our purposes, the Earth is still the center of the universe?
Anyone of the team want to take that one?
Yeah, I'd say just a matter of perspective and what you mean by center, but I certainly greatly appreciate your point, philosophically speaking.
But you know, from a philosophical point of view, every time historically we've claimed that, we've been wrong. You know, they thought that the sun orbited the Earth, and from the biological point of view, it looks like it was easy to start life. And you've told us that it's hard to kill life. So given that we have so many exoplanets and the ingredients for life are actually made in space, all the organic compounds, water, you know, I can't see why there wouldn't be life elsewhere. I think it's absolutely common. The thing I think may not be so common is advanced technological life, because it will have a much shorter slice of the time span when it can live on a world.
I'm with you, Karen. And I think it's ironic that Rich's scenario, which is one that he described that we should fear, might be the one that keeps us alive long enough to get to another star.
That's not so much a fear, that's a good thing. But let's see. Make sure I'm not missing. Here's one from Al. Is there a scenario for the biblical holocaust of water covering the world? Well, certainly when Earth had first formed, we didn't have continental land masses at all. And so we probably were a water world. I think a water world is not a good thing to have in general, because without the dry land and oceans, you don't have the chemical cycling to keep a world habitable. I don't think any other time in history have we ever had a complete water world. We've certainly had an ice-covered world, but once you started to get continents that have the mountains and volcanoes, there simply hasn't been enough water on Earth to cover everything. The average depth of the oceans, correct me if I'm wrong, Grieg, isn't it about 4 kilometers? And with the topography we have, there just isn't enough water. Although we surprisingly don't actually know how much water we have on Earth, because there's a lot inside the Earth, which may be far more than what we have on the surface. Let's see. From Sarah Lynn, how close to Earth was Oumuamua? Should we be scared? That was our first interstellar visitor, and its closest approach was 63 times the Earth-Moon distance. So is that scary, Larry? And we didn't know about it till after it had passed by.
That's pretty close by our standards.
That was 1/10 of a kilometer in radius, so 200 meters across. That would have been bad news, wouldn't it?
Would have, yes.
Is that a global extinction? What's the scale of destruction for 200-meter object?
That's probably on the continental level. Somewhat localized, probably not covering the Earth in ash and stuff, but large scale destruction.
Given our population today, that's really bad.
Yes, yeah. Fortunately, space is big, and so something shooting randomly through the solar system has small odds of hitting us.
So next one from Edmund. I guess this might be going to Grieg. Gene editing, good or bad?
Sure. All depends on what you do with it.
All right, so Hua-Chen, the great filter theory attributes our failure of detecting ET to the limited duration of any civilization for natural or self-made reasons. Of all the factors discussed today, which is more likely the most important one for the demise of a civilization? Well, that's effectively asking the same question as our poll. Which end of life Earth scenarios worries you the most? So the most effective. Well, I'll let each person give their own view. My personal view is large volcanic eruptions, because other than leaving Earth, I don't know that we would necessarily predict them. There's nothing we can do about it. And it's going to happen for sure. So that scares me the most. And I think that's most likely the demise of plant and animal life. And if civilization's still around, that would do it. So the rest of the committee, what do you guys think?
That was my vote as well.
Mine too.
Yeah, I remember when Mike Model first gave that talk, and it's just every question was for him, because he was almost playfully convinced of the inevitability of this thing. So I'm there with you.
So at this point, we're at about 3:30 and should probably wrap up our Q&A session. But I'd like to end by extending a final thank you to all of our speakers today. So thank you, Karen, Grieg, Rich, and Larry. It was really wonderful to have you all with us today.
Thank you.
And I'd like to thank all of our audience members with us as well. Thank you for tuning in. We look forward to seeing you at our next event. And so you can expect to hear from us with an invitation for July 21st at 2 p.m. We will have Dr. Shaya Honavar, who is the director of the Pacific Cooperative Studies Unit in the College of Natural Sciences, and she's going to be speaking on ecosystem integrity and biodiversity in Hawaii. Thanks again, everyone, and aloha.